So the first two steps, we were dealing with units. We were coming up with numbers of units. Steps 3, 4, and 5, we're dealing with costs. So these are going to be dollar amounts. So step 3 is we determine the total cost for the department or process for the period. And again, we're going to be tracking the costs by direct materials and conversion costs, because when we come to the average, we're going to have to divide the cost by the number of equivalent units, and we've got different equivalent units for direct materials and conversion costs. That's why we have to have these broken down. So the cost for the department, we started off with costs in the work in process inventory account at the beginning of the period. So that's our starting point. The beginning inventory, direct materials costs, and conversion costs amounts. Then, after we finish, then we would have needed to incur costs to finish the beginning work in process inventory and then incur more costs for the units we were starting from scratch. So then all of the costs that were incurred during the period for the department, again, broken down between direct materials and conversion costs. We add these together, that gives us the total costs to account for. Okay. Step 4, then, now we can get the average cost per equivalent unit. So we're going to take those costs that we've accumulated, divide that by the number of equivalent units. That's going to give us our cost per equivalent unit. That's the 4th step in the process. So in our example here for Crawford, right, we left off where we calculated the total equivalent units. Now we want to calculate, for direct materials and conversion costs, the total cost to account for. So we've got our beginning work in process inventory, and then we have the costs added during the period. That'll give us our total costs to account for. So our information tells us that our beginning inventory, we had 100,000 units of beginning inventory, is comprised of 100,000 of direct materials and 55,000 of conversion costs. And then they tell us direct materials costs added in May were 350,000 and conversion costs were 150,000. So we can see the total cost to account for 450,000 for direct materials, 205,000 for conversion costs. So now we want to calculate the cost per equivalent unit for direct materials, cost per equivalent unit for conversion costs. So to get our cost per equivalent unit, we'll take our total costs to account for. I'm just going to bring this down. That's not what I wanted. And we'll divide that. Alright, so our total cost to account for divided by our total equivalent units. We're doing this for direct materials costs in part D. So our total cost to account for direct materials we can get from above. That's the 450. And the total equivalent units for direct materials we calculated in part B, 900,000 units. So we can divide the 450 gets divided by the 900,000. So 50 cents is our cost per equivalent unit for direct materials. We want to do the same thing for conversion costs. So the total cost to account for conversion costs, we said was 205. And we're going to divide that by the equivalent units for conversion costs that we calculated up here. And we said for conversion costs, the equivalent units for conversion costs is 820,000. So we're going to divide here. And we get 25 cents per unit. We're ready to do the last step in the 5-step process. Now we're going to actually use these cost per equivalent units to determine the cost of the units that moved on to the next department, as well as determine the cost of our ending work in process inventory. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to take the equivalent units completed and transferred, multiply that by the cost per equivalent unit, and that will tell us the costs assigned to the units that completed and moved on. Okay. So we can do it for direct materials and conversion costs and then add that together, but really the equivalent units completed and transferred is going to be the same for direct materials and conversion costs because these units are all the way done. So we could take the total equivalent units and multiply it by the total cost per equivalent unit, right? The total cost would be the direct material cost per equivalent unit plus the conversion cost per equivalent unit. You could do it both ways without having to break it out into so many steps. But then we also want to assign the total cost to the units in ending work in process inventory. And this one we do need to do for direct materials and conversion costs and then add the totals together because we're going to have a different equivalent units for ending work in process than we do have for conversion costs. So we'll take the equivalent units, multiply the cost per equivalent unit, that gives us the cost assigned to ending work in process. And we should be able to see that the total cost to account for equal the total costs accounted for. And then we'll end up making that journal entry to transfer the costs for the units completed out of this department's work in process inventory and put it into the next department's work in process inventory. So let's see how this looks in our example. So what is the total cost of the units transferred out in May? So we need the equivalent units completed and transferred. And we're going to multiply that by the cost per equivalent unit. I'll just abbreviate. Alright, so we can do it in two steps. So the equivalent units completed and transferred. Up here we said the units that were completed and transferred was 700,000 for both direct materials and conversion costs. The cost per equivalent unit for direct materials we said was 50 cents a unit. Oh, let me change my decimal places here. I'm going to increase the decimal. Okay. The cost per equivalent unit for conversion costs was 25. So we could have just said 700,000 times 75 cents. We didn't have to do this in two steps, but here it is. So 700,000 times 50 cents means the direct materials cost in those units that completed and transferred was $350. The conversion cost for the units completed and transferred is $175,000. So the cost of the units completed and transferred comes to $525,000. The cost of the ending work in process. So we need the equivalent units in ending work in process inventory. We're going to multiply that by the cost per equivalent unit, and that'll give us our cost of ending work in process inventory. So for direct materials, the equivalent units in ending work in process was 200,000. For conversion costs, we had equivalent units in ending work in process inventory was 120,000. Multiply that by the cost per equivalent unit, 50 cents for direct materials, 25 cents for conversion costs. $100,000 is the cost of the direct materials in our ending work in process. $30,000 is the cost of conversion costs in our ending work in process. So that means we have $130,000 is the cost of our ending work in process inventory. We can then add together the cost we've assigned to the units completed and transferred and the cost we've assigned to ending work in process, and we can see the total cost we've accounted for. So if we add the 525 and the 130, we have 655,000 costs that we can account for. And if we can come up here when we were accumulating our costs, our total costs to account for came up to 655,000. So these were the costs of the department, and of that 655, 525,000 was assigned to the units completed and transferred. 130,000 was assigned to our ending inventory. So the journal entry that we would make to show the costs that were transferred on to the next department, well, we would debit the work in process inventory for Department B, because that's where the costs are going, and we would credit the work in process inventory Department A, because the costs are coming out of Department A's work in process inventory, and that would be for the amount that we calculated for the units completed and transferred. So we said 525,000 of the Department A costs moved on to Department B. And so we would do that for each department. The thing being is now Department B, they've got 525,000 in costs, plus all the costs that they're adding. Okay, so we're just going to look at the one department, because once you understand the process for assigning the costs, I mean, you could do it in subsequent departments, and so I think we've gotten a very good handle on how to do this.